Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Ben Klein, and I'm a current graduate student at Idaho State University, and I'm here to talk about the experience of LGBT plus individuals in STEM higher education. So evidence suggests that LGBT plus individuals face systemic disadvantages in STEM education and in subsequent career paths. However, most contemporary studies examine social climate or the degree to which LGBT plus individuals feel welcome and accepted in a given environment. However, there is limited empirical evidence that examines the disadvantages outside of individual perceptions of LGBT plus peoples. As such, the purpose of this video is to examine existing evidence in scientific literature to better understand the experiences of students and faculty in STEM higher ed that identify as part of the LGBT plus community. Here's my research question, which I've already detailed briefly, but to reiterate, how does LGBT plus identity shape the experiences of individuals in STEM higher ed? Briefly, during my talk today, I'm going to begin by covering some terminology, after which I'll examine a little bit of the historical literature in LGBT plus higher education. And then I'll dive into two sections that examine contemporary research in the field of LGBT plus in higher ed. And then I'll wrap up with some summary and conclusions and some potential steps for moving forward. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, I wanted to start with some terminology. As a person who identifies as part of the LGBT plus community, I get a lot of questions about the difference between gender and sexuality and how do they interact with each other. Generally, gender can be broken down into identity and expression. Now, this could be a whole video in and of itself, but I'm going to cover some topics just briefly to better orient you for the rest of my talk. So gender identity is generally what an individual identifies as or how someone feels about their own gender. An example of a gender could be a cisgendered male. Gender expression is how an individual expresses themselves and how others perceive them. This could be through clothes, behavior, speech, or even body type. Then when we think about sexuality, gender, we have to think about sex assigned at birth. So you may be familiar with the terms cisgender and transgender. Cis people are individuals that have a gender identity that matches that assigned at birth, whereas transgender people are people who have a gender identity that is different from what was assigned at birth. When it comes to sexuality, it's all about attraction. And this can be partitioned into physical attraction or emotional attraction. But there could even be the component of the lack of physical or emotional attraction. So the big takeaway for this is that there's a lot of complexity between gender and sexuality, and it's important to be considerate of these factors when we talk about members of the LGBT plus community. Speaking of the LGBT plus community, what does that acronym stand for anyway? If we're going back to our roots, the full acronym is actually LGBTQIA2S+. This stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, intersex, asexual, two-spirit, and the plus accounts for countless other forms of expression. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to shorten everything to LGBT plus or LGBTQ plus, which are common ways to shorten the acronym. However, if you're ever unsure for what you should say, and you're in the presence of someone who identifies as part of the LGBT plus community, it never hurts to ask. So to be able to understand the challenges associated with a particular contemporary issue, it's also essential to examine historical evidence that has shaped modern perception of that issue. So in this case, early literature in the LGBT plus experience in higher ed has documented discrimination in the US education system. Additionally, there's also a significant erasure of the LGBT plus experience in the pre-Stonewall period. So that would be any time before the late 1960s. However, one interesting study that I found was from Nash and Silverman in 1948. These researchers examined something known as the gay purges, which occurred in the late 1940s. These so-called gay purges occurred at prominent universities, such as the universities of Wisconsin, Texas, and Missouri. And in this study, the authors detail the role of the anti-gay agenda and the administrative power that was used to remove both gay students and faculty from college campuses simply on the basis of their sexuality. Now, not surprisingly, this focuses primarily on the identity of cisgendered white gay men, which only comprise a small proportion of the LGBT plus community. As such, let's jump into some of the more contemporary examples in the literature that look at the experiences of LGBT plus peoples in a more holistic point of view. It wasn't until much more recently that social scientists and researchers have begun to examine the factors that influence the experiences of LGBT plus peoples in higher education. Most early studies have examined something referred to as campus climate. This is something that is identified as the degree of belonging an individual feels in a specific setting, or how welcome one feels over an entire campus. For the portion of this area of research, I'm going to split it into two sections, first by detailing student experiences and then examining faculty experiences. So in 2018, Bryce Hughes published an article titled Coming Out in STEM, which examines the factors that influence retention and recruitment of sexual minority students in STEM. Obviously, recruitment and retention are major issues for LGBT plus peoples, especially if they feel unwelcome on a college campus. Hughes found that LGBT plus individuals were 8% less likely to remain in a STEM major or in the STEM field during their undergraduate experience. This is despite a higher likelihood of having participated in undergraduate research or other activities that are associated with high achievement. Students also reported feelings of discrimination from peers as well as professors. And interestingly enough, Hughes identified that there is actually a reversal from the typical gender binary when it came to LGBT plus people. In this case, LGBT plus men were less likely to remain in STEM than LGBT women, which is perhaps opposite of what we would expect. It's also critical to consider the experiences of faculty members. These are individuals that have already made it through their undergraduate and even their graduate experience, and as such, they may have different perceptions. However, in this 2014 study by Patridge et al., the researchers identified that LGBT plus individuals that were out, or in other words, had disclosed their sexual orientation to peers or supervisors, were more likely to feel unwelcome, to experience exclusionary behavior, and were more likely to leave STEM. As you can see on the figure on the left-hand side of the screen, they also identified that simply being out resulted in a higher proportion of individuals being uncomfortable, whereas not disclosing their identity improved comfort for these individuals. Those studies are excellent starting points, but we're interested in examining beyond just experiences and feelings of people that identify as LGBT plus in higher education. And I'm interested in actually quantifying the systemic disadvantages that LGBT plus people face in higher education. However, there's a couple challenges associated with this. First is that there is a large dearth of data when it comes to LGBT plus status. The federal government does not measure sexual orientation or gender identity in any nationally representative data set. As such, there is a lack of information regarding sexual identity for many individuals. And such, it's harder to comprise a study that doesn't have the needed data. Additionally, LGBT issues are largely understudied and even assumed to be a non-issue in some instances. As I mentioned previously, there are few studies that actually provide empirical evidence of systemic disadvantages. And as Lang et al. In 2019 discuss, just because LGBT plus peoples may not face violence on a day-to-day basis, that doesn't mean that they've completely matriculated into society and are globally accepted. However, this is a common misconception, which leads individuals to think that LGBT plus status is a non-issue in higher education. Furthermore, examining these systemic disadvantages is a primary goal of the 2021 study in Science Advances, which is perhaps the largest study to date examining LGBT plus experiences in STEM and higher education. In this study, there were over 25,000 respondents, of which over 1,000 identified as LGBT plus. The researchers examined 6 areas of LGBT plus adversity in STEM while holding all other factors such as gender, race, and age constant. I'm briefly going to demonstrate their results for each of the 6 sections outlined below to get a more holistic perspective of the systemic disadvantages that LGBT plus peoples face. Starting with career opportunities and resources, the researchers determined that LGBT plus individuals faced reduced career opportunities. These could be things such as promotions or administrative roles, as well as reduced access to resources such as funding, grants, and also reduced comfort level in whistleblowing. In terms of professional devaluation, LGBT plus individuals also experienced a higher occurrence of professional devaluation from their supervisors and peers when compared to that of their straight counterparts. Examples of this include being told their science wasn't quality or that their expertise was not sufficient. In terms of social exclusion, LGBT plus individuals experienced a higher occurrence of social exclusion from their supervisors and peers as well. It is known that a social network can be a critical component that encourages comfort in a workplace, and as such, LGBT people are less likely to feel welcome and included. When it comes to harassment, LGBT plus individuals also face higher occurrence of harassment when compared to their straight counterparts. And even difficulties when it comes to health and wellness. LGBT plus individuals reported a higher occurrence of minor health problems, insomnia, work-related stress, and even depressive symptoms. And as previous studies have examined, the researchers also were interested in understanding intentions to leave STEM. They found that there was a higher occurrence of thoughts about leaving STEM. This included both leaving a current job for a different job or even leaving the STEM field as a whole. As this study details, shifting the focus away from campus climate is integral. Siegel in 2019 identifies a new term coined microclimate, which addresses the experiences of individuals within a single institution instead of examining the campus climate, which often refers to conditions students experience across an entire university. An example of a microclimate could be for a transgender student who may find support from specific individuals, such as an academic advisor, or in specific spaces, such as the Gender Resource Center, but may feel unwelcome or even excluded in others. Because of these complex interpersonal relationships and the generally systemic transphobia that students face, each situation requires unique context to understand and examine. Furthermore, researchers and institutions should also focus on the effects of systemic change in improving the experience for LGBT plus peoples. This includes improving representation, recruitment, and retention of LGBT plus peoples. An example of this could be actively welcoming and recruiting LGBT plus people during student engagement and faculty searches. Furthermore, meeting employee needs such as providing domestic partner benefits as individuals from heterosexual partnerships would receive. In an instance where hard benefits might not be able to be offered, even soft benefits have been shown to improve the experience of LGBT plus faculty. Additionally, gestures of goodwill to prospective students and faculty can also play a major role in their comfort level within a university. This includes things like offering additional resources or even network connections to other LGBT plus peoples within an institution. Just to recap, the research question of my study was, how does LGBT plus identity shape the experiences of individuals in STEM and higher education? As detailed in my video, there are a variety of reasons that offer explanations as to why LGBT plus status influences the perceptions and experiences of STEM individuals in higher education. Early studies point to campus climate and feelings of includedness as being the most important predictors of LGBT plus recruitment and retention. However, more recent advances point to complex factors such as employee health and benefits, campus microclimates, and intersectional identity as being critical factors that influence the experiences of LGBT plus people in higher education. Moving forward, some future directions include, obviously, the additional collection of data. Without sufficient data, it's hard to make conclusions about the experiences of LGBT plus people. Obviously, increasing the amount of data generated is something that takes time and a lot of funding. So in the meantime, I have a few other recommendations for folks to consider. One of the key points that is highlighted in this presentation is that recent socio-historical perception of LGBT plus individuals, particularly trans identities, is considered to be at a historical tipping point, suggesting that LGBT plus peoples have been integrated and are universally accepted in society. However, this perspective is limited in the sense that it accepts that LGBT plus people do not face overt forms of violence on a daily basis, but it ignores the persistent biases and disproportionate marginalization faced by LGBT plus individuals that are not considered the norm, aka white, middle class, and able-bodied in a white supremacist society like the United States. Future work in the experiences of LGBT plus people in higher education should focus on uplifting the voices of transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming experiences. Additionally, the intersectionality of other parts of identity, such as age, race, and ability. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to my presentation. One of the best ways that you can support the LGBT plus community is through your direct financial support. If you enjoyed my presentation and you care about the experiences of LGBT plus peoples in higher education, I would strongly urge you to consider donating to one of the nonprofits that I've shared on screen. Additionally, you could also consider supporting another nonprofit of your choice, even one in your local community. Thank you all for your time, and I hope you have a great day.